Okay, so let's try to understand a function value parameter, like when to use. Let me create a new page. Okay, so recall a function value parameter copies values to a different address location. So even though we're dealing with memory, copies, they take a while. But copying like a simple integer, so we go here, like we can copy an integer, an integer, a double, a character, other fundamental types. What's that? Like long int and unsigned int. You don't have to know those, right? But other data types, they do not take a lot of memory. So copying them from one memory location to another is not going to slow down our program. It's not going to make our program any less efficient. What about when to use a reference parameter and this one maybe I should just do it over here. When to use a reference parameter. So a reference parameter doesn't copy values. It just references addresses. So we can use it when we use like lists or strings as parameters. And the question is, well, why? Well, the list is kind of like easier to understand. A list can have one element or it can have 10,000 elements. So we do not want to be copying 10,000 elements all over our memory because it takes a while and our program will bog down and we're going to have frustrated users. And so let me briefly explain, right? I'm just going to create a small list. And we have this, and we have heap or free store. Stack. Assuming main was loaded. Assuming main is loaded, and main has some list. Even let's say like 10,000 elements, right? Just we're not gonna write 10,000 elements, right? We'll just use 3 elements, but just to understand why we use references, right? So we're like, okay, so 10K, so we're like, okay, so some list, so the list would be here, and then the list references the memory location, and then this would be like element 1 of 10,000, okay? And then element 2, element 3, and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to write all of them, right? Of 10K. So if we pass it as a value parameter, we're going to have to copy 10,000 elements to some other memory location. And we don't want to do that. Instead, assuming this was addressed like maybe Y120, we just use a reference parameter, and now we're just passing in the address into the function, right? So we don't have to copy 10,000 elements just to use our list in a function parameter. So that's the use case for reference variables. Did Python pass my list as references? Yes. If you were using Python, Python was, if you were using list and functions for Python, it was not copying the whole list. It was just passing in the address of the first element of that function, and then Python behind the scenes would reference, and it wouldn't be copying. It would just be copying one address, because one address is stored in less memory space, maybe 4 bytes, right? Then 10,000 times 4, right? So then we're like copying a lot of data. So that's when we use reference parameters. Questions here? Okay, so now we were like, okay, so value is for characters, integers, doubles. They don't take a lot of memory. It's not going to cost us a lot to copy them. Lists, if it's a large list, we don't want to be copying around. But what if this list here is like, for example, the payroll checks? Why am I bringing this up? So we go back to the example here. In main, we can change the value of variables that we reference. So that's why I bring up payroll checks, right? Because it's kind of like, hey, wait a minute. Like, what if I pass the company payroll checks to a function? And the rule is in programming that if a developer can do something, eventually they're going to do something, even though that something is something we don't want to do. In this case, change the value of the employee checks, right? Maybe they do it inadvertently, but then we can get into that issue. It's kind of like, hey, wait a minute. Like, if we're dealing with payroll checks, we don't want to pass them in as references, or what do we do in this case, right? So let me stop and start another video to discuss